Welcome to Sew Very Easy. My name is Laura, and a friend of mine has come out with a new fabric lineup. Now, this line of fabric is from Northcott, and the designer is Brent Lewis. Now, he is a fellow Bernina ambassador and a friend of mine, and these fabrics are so nice. The colors are beautiful, and the designs are really a lot of fun. So I'd like to share with you today his free pattern and how fun this will go together. The fabric is called Water's Edge. So we have things that are associated with around the water. Frogs and lily pads, beautiful flowers, and in here, these are little butterflies around flowers. More butterflies, moths, some dragonflies, and some big prints. So we have this beautiful big print, and this big print comes in two different variations with this beautiful blue background and a purple background. And he's designed a pattern to go with this fabric. And the great part is it starts with one pack of 10-inch squares. Each one of these pieces are quarter square triangles. So they're going to go together quick and easy. So we're going to be able to use all 42 of those squares. And we're going to take those 10-inch squares and turn them into this block. There are a few tricks along the way to make these quick and easy to do. We're going to start with those 10-inch squares of fabric, and we're going to make half square triangles. And we're going to place right sides together of a dark and a light. From there, we're going to do that typical half square triangle, draw the line down the center, and stitch on each side. When we do that and cut those apart, we're going to have these big half square triangles. We need to take those fabrics and press them to the darker side. From here, we're going to match up, and those seams are going to be opposing. So we're going to be able to just slide those together. Draw that line and stitch on each side. But before I draw that line, I do like to press these and starch them together. So you can use a starch or any starch alternative. Press them good, and then just do a little bit of starch on the one. Put those two together, line them up, and you can feel that those seams are going to be opposing. And press. Do not iron, just press that iron up and down. That starch and that starch alternative works a little bit like an adhesive, and it's going to hold it together for us, so we won't have to do as much pinning. I then will draw my line from corner to corner. Put 2 pins. I'm going to pin that one seam allowance and the seam allowance underneath. This is going to hold down that seam allowance along that back side. And I make sure those pins are just a little bit out of the way, so I do not need to remove them. I keep those pins there until both the seams are done. I just make sure that the pins are out of that way. Now that I have that seam going in the one direction and in the other, I'm going to be able to remove those pins. From here, we're going to do an additional pressing. Setting that seam means that we've had those 2 pieces of fabric and we have stitching that goes on both sides of that fabric. Well, that thread is sort of sitting on top of the fabric. When we press it, we're forcing that thread to go into the fibers. So those threads being pressed in are better than the threads sitting on the top. From there, we're going to trim these down to 8.5-inch squares. So we could just cut those apart, press, and try to center them. The problem is a lot of times these corners don't necessarily want to line up. So I force that line up before I cut them. And I'm going to help them line up with the temporary glue. Before we glue this, it's important that we make sure that that seam is straight against that thread and that we've not folded over a little edge. Make sure that that's nice and flat. Put a couple of drops of glue, match that up, Run it right to the end. Make sure that that matches. And now press this flat. You can see where that block is nice and flat, and that little bit of glue is holding that corner together for me. From here, we're going to be able to trim that right in half. I don't want to open it because I want to take advantage of this little glued area. Now there's a lot of different square up rulers you can get, but an 8.5-inch ruler I find really does work the best. And I'm going to use that center line. That center line is sitting on my stitching line, not the cut line. It has to sit right along whatever that is. So it doesn't matter what your seam allowance is. That line from corner to corner is going to sit on the seam. So you can see I have a little bit hanging out, but that center line is fitting on that seam. Then I can take that corner and I'm going to be able to slide that ruler until it comes right to this point. This should be pretty close to that center mark. If it's off a little bit, it's going to be fine. So now I have those two edges I can trim off. I know that little glue is holding that down for me, so I know it's not going to shift. So my line and my point are my most important things. The rest sort of just fall into place. And if you'd like, you can trim off your little dog ears. I now have that perfect 8.5-inch square. So when I go to open this, there still might be just a little snippet of glue here, and I'm just going to pull it apart. I have two perfect points up in that corner. And if it was off a little bit, this will press in. And of course, we are pressing, we're not ironing. We have that center that's perfectly matched, and our four corners come to great little points. Now, if you don't have an 8.5-inch square ruler, you can use a longer ruler. Everything's going to be the same. I did glue that corner, and I pressed and set that seam. This is an 8.5-inch by 24-inch ruler. I'm going to use that 45-degree angle and put it on the seam and make sure my point is there, and then I can trim those sides. You can do even a larger ruler. What I want to do is follow the direction of my numbers. So I'm going to go down to 8.5 inches on both sides of that ruler. So that 8.5-inch mark on both sides will fit that seam. It's actually pointing to the seam. So it's telling you, this is my 8.5-inch mark. This is my 8.5-inch mark. I still have that center point that I can use. So let's say we're going to square something up to 4 inches. I'm going to find that 4-inch mark and my 4-inch mark. The center of the ruler, my 4 is pointing to those seams. So it doesn't matter what size. If it's 6, the 6 is pointing right on that seam. We're not paying attention to the seam allowance, just that stitching line. And then we're going to be able to square that off. So whatever measurement you have is what it's going to be pointing to. From here, we're just going to be able to put all of our pieces together. We can do them in rows, or you can do them in blocks. I'm going to sew it all together, and I'm going to show you how pretty this does turn out to be. Those rich blues, greens, and purples really do go nice on this quilt. And that little hint of that light color really does give it that sparkle. You really see those different, rich, vibrant colors. Now, a quarter square triangle is not hard to make, especially if you follow some of those tricks along the way, and it's going to keep all of our points together. So for the quilt called Frog Pond, I'm going to put the frogs on the back that are sitting on those lily pads. It's a fun pattern to make, especially when we start off with those 10-inch pre-cut squares. Thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and I do have a newsletter. It's all free under Sew Very Easy. Thanks again for joining me, and be sure to make every day a Sewtacular day. Bye for now.